3 days. That was all the time Mara Hale had left before her father's debt would destroy everything her family had ever built. She stood in the kitchen of their small apartment, staring at a letter she had already read 4 times. The numbers on the page did not change no matter how many times her eyes moved across them. Her father, Edward Hale, sat at the table with his head down, his hands shaking slightly around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. "I did not want you to know," he said quietly. "I thought I could fix it before it reached you." Mara did not answer right away. She was 26 years old, and until this morning she had believed her father's business troubles were ordinary. Late payments, slow months, the usual worries of a man who owned a small furniture shop. She did not know he had borrowed money from people who did not send polite reminders. She did not know the men who came to collect it did not accept apologies. Her younger sister, Lily, was still asleep upstairs, unaware that their entire world was balanced on the edge of a knife. Mara wanted to keep it that way for as long as possible. "How much do we owe?" she asked. Her father told her the number, and for a moment, the room felt smaller than it actually was. "There is no way we can pay that," Mara whispered. "There might be one way," her father said, though he clearly hated saying it. "There is a man. People call him the last option, because when everything else fails, he is the only one who can still help, or hurt, depending on his mood." "What is his name?" Her father hesitated before answering. "Damian Cross." The name landed in the room like something heavy dropped from a great height. Mara had heard it before, whispered in the kind of tone people used when discussing storms or wildfires. Something powerful, something you did not provoke, something you simply hoped would pass you by. "They say he owns half the businesses downtown without anyone knowing it," her father continued. "They say he settles debts on one night each year, at a private event most people never hear about. If you can get an invitation, and if you can convince him, he can make this disappear." "And if I can't convince him?" Her father did not answer that question. He did not need to. That night, Mara lay awake, staring at the ceiling, running through every possible plan in her mind. She thought about selling the apartment. She thought about asking relatives who barely spoke to them anymore. She thought about walking into a bank and begging for a loan no bank would ever approve. Every path led back to the same locked door, and behind that door stood a man she had never met, but somehow already feared. By morning, she had made her decision. She would go to him. She would ask. She would do whatever it took to protect her father and her sister, even if it meant standing in front of a man capable of ruining people with a single sentence. Getting an invitation to the event was harder than she expected. It was not something advertised anywhere. It was something passed quietly between people who owed him favors, spoken in restaurants and back rooms, never written down. Mara spent 2 full days calling in every connection her father had left, most of which led nowhere. On the 3rd day, a family friend who once worked for Damian's organization finally agreed to help, though his hands trembled the entire time he wrote down the address. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "When you go there, do not lie to him. Do not try to be clever. He sees through everyone in seconds. If you want mercy, you ask plainly, and you accept whatever he decides. What if he decides to say no?" The man looked at her with something close to pity. "Then you walk away and hope he forgets your face." That evening, Mara stood in front of her closet, searching for something appropriate to wear to an event she did not fully understand. She borrowed a dress from her sister, deep green with simple lines, elegant but not flashy. It did not fit her perfectly, but there was no time to fix that now. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back, someone trying to look confident while her hands would not stop shaking. Lily found her getting ready and asked where she was going. "A work event," Mara lied gently. "Nothing important." Her sister, only 19, did not question it further, though something in her expression suggested she sensed more was happening than anyone was telling her. Mara hugged her a little longer than usual before leaving, memorizing the feeling in case tonight went badly. The address led her to a part of the city she rarely visited, where old buildings had been quietly restored into something far more expensive than they appeared from the outside. The entrance had no sign, only a heavy door and two men standing beside it, watching everyone who approached with careful, unreadable expressions. Mara gave her name. One of the men checked a list, found it, and stepped aside without a word. Inside, the world changed completely. Soft golden light spilled across polished floors. Music drifted from somewhere she could not immediately locate. Men and women in expensive clothing moved through the room with the quiet confidence of people who had never once worried about money in their lives. Mara felt like an intruder in her borrowed dress, standing at the edge of a world she did not belong to. She scanned the crowd, searching for any sign of the man she had come to find, though she had no idea what he looked like. No photographs of him existed publicly. No interviews, no records anyone could easily access. He was a name without a face, and that made him more frightening, not less. A server offered her a drink. She declined, needing every part of her mind sharp and clear. Minutes passed, then an hour. Mara began to wonder if she had wasted her only chance, if perhaps the man never even attended these events himself, sending representatives instead while he remained safely hidden elsewhere. Then the room shifted, subtly but unmistakably. Conversations did not stop, but they softened. Heads turned slightly, then turned back, as though no one wanted to be caught looking too directly. Mara followed their attention toward the far side of the room, where a man had just entered through a side door, moving without hurry, without announcement, and without the slightest need for either. He was tall, dressed in dark clothing with no unnecessary decoration, the kind of outfit that did not need to prove anything because the man wearing it clearly did not need to prove anything either. His expression was calm, almost bored, though his eyes moved across the room with the precision of someone cataloging every detail at once. Mara did not need anyone to tell her his name. She simply knew. Damian Cross. Her heart began beating faster, though she forced her face to remain still. She had come this far. Turning back now would help no one. She watched him move through the crowd, greeting a few people with brief nods, ignoring most others entirely. He did not seem to be searching for anyone in particular, which somehow made him more intimidating, not less. He carried himself like a man who had never once needed to search for anything, because everything eventually came to him instead. Mara took a slow breath, straightened her shoulders, and began walking toward him before her courage could fail her. She was 3 steps away when he turned his head slightly and looked directly at her, as though he had noticed her presence long before she noticed him noticing. "You are not on my usual list of faces," he said, his voice low and unreadable, "which means you want something." Mara's mouth went dry. Every rehearsed sentence she had prepared disappeared from her mind at once. "I need your help," she finally managed. "My family owes a debt we cannot pay. I was told you sometimes forgive debts here, in exchange for something." His expression did not change, though something behind his eyes sharpened slightly, like a predator recognizing familiar prey. "Many people ask me that," he said. "Most of them bore me within the first sentence." "I am not asking for charity," Mara said, forcing steadiness into her voice. "I am asking for a trade. Whatever you require, within reason, I will consider it." For a long moment, he studied her without speaking, as though weighing something invisible on an invisible scale. The music continued around them, oblivious to the silent negotiation taking place between two people who had never spoken before tonight. "There is a tradition at these gatherings," he finally said. "One dance. If you ask correctly, and if I accept, certain debts can be forgiven before the song ends. It is my choice entirely, and my choice alone." Mara understood immediately what he was offering, and what he was not promising. "Then I am asking," she said, "one dance, in exchange for erasing what my family owes." He extended his hand, palm upward, waiting. "Very well," he said. "Let us see if you are worth the trouble." Mara placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and unexpected steadiness of his grip, and allowed him to lead her toward the center of the floor, where dozens of eyes quietly turned to watch a stranger step into a world she did not yet understand was about to change everything. The music slowed as they reached the center of the floor, and Damian pulled her gently into position, one hand resting against her back, the other holding hers with a firmness that felt less like romance and more like control disguised as courtesy. "Relax," he said quietly. "You look like you are bracing for an accident." "I am bracing for an accident," Mara replied before she could stop herself. For the briefest moment, something flickered across his face that might have been amusement, though it disappeared before she could be certain. "Tell me about this debt," he said as they began to move slowly with the music. "Names, numbers, everything." Mara explained quickly and honestly, just as she had been advised, keeping her voice steady, even as her mind raced through the possibility that this entire plan might fail before the song even ended. She told him about her father's shop, about the men who had come to their apartment, about the number that had made the room feel smaller than it truly was. Damian listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable the entire time. "I know the men your father borrowed from," he said once she finished. "They work loosely under someone I do business with occasionally. This is a small matter for someone like me." Hope rose in Mara's chest, though she forced herself not to show it too quickly. "Does that mean you will help?" "It means I could," he said. "Whether I will depends on what happens for the rest of this dance." The song continued, and Mara found herself studying him the way he had studied her earlier, searching for something human beneath the calm exterior. She noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly when the topic of family was mentioned, as though it touched something he did not often allow near the surface. "You do not seem like someone who forgives debts easily," she said. "I do not," he agreed. "But I am curious about people who walk into a room like this without shaking apart. Most do not manage that." "I am shaking apart," Mara admitted. "I am simply doing it quietly." That earned the smallest trace of a smile, gone almost as quickly as it appeared. The song began drawing toward its end, the melody slowing, softening, preparing to release them both back into the noise of the room. Mara felt a strange reluctance she did not expect, some small part of her disappointed that the conversation would end here, in the middle of a debt negotiation disguised as a dance. As the final notes faded, Damian did not release her hand. "The debt is forgiven," he said simply. "Consider it handled by tomorrow morning." Relief flooded through Mara so quickly she nearly lost her balance. "Thank you," she whispered. "You have no idea what this means to my family." "I have some idea," he said, "but that is not the part you should be worried about right now." Mara frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "You asked for one dance," he said, his tone calm, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling. "I never agreed that one dance would be the end of anything." The music had stopped, but he still had not let go of her hand. "What exactly does that mean?" Mara asked carefully. "It means," Damian said, leading her slowly toward the edge of the floor instead of releasing her into the crowd, "that you are far more interesting than the debt you came here to erase. And I am not in the habit of letting interesting things simply walk away." Mara felt the first genuine flicker of fear since stepping through the door that night, though it was tangled with something else entirely, something she did not yet have a name for. "I have a family waiting for me," she said. "I cannot stay here." "You are not staying tonight," Damian said, "but this is not goodbye either." He guided her toward a quiet hallway away from the main room, where the noise of the party faded into something more private, more serious. "Tomorrow, the debt disappears," he continued. "In exchange, you will come here again next week. Not for a favor, not for money, simply to have dinner with me." "That was not part of the arrangement," Mara said. "It is now," he replied, his voice calm but final, the tone of a man who was used to rearranging arrangements to fit his own preferences without asking permission first. "Consider it a new term, added after the original agreement was already accepted." Mara stared at him, torn between gratitude for what he had already promised to do for her family and unease at how easily he had shifted the terms of their exchange without giving her any real choice in the matter. "And if I refuse?" she asked. Damian studied her for a long moment, something calculating behind his calm expression. "You will not refuse," he said quietly, "because you already understand that I could just as easily change my mind about the debt as well." It was not quite a threat. It was something colder than that, something wrapped in the appearance of generosity, while quietly reminding her exactly who controlled every outcome in this conversation. "One dinner," Mara said finally, choosing her words carefully. "That is all I agreed to tonight." "One dinner," Damian repeated, though something in the way he said it suggested he already knew, with complete confidence, that this would not be the last time their paths crossed. He walked her to the entrance himself, ignoring the curious glances from other guests, who clearly were not used to seeing him personally escort anyone, anywhere. At the door, he finally released her hand. "Someone will contact you about the details," he said. "Do not keep me waiting." Mara stepped outside into the cool night air, her mind spinning with everything that had just happened. Her family's debt would disappear by morning, a miracle she could barely process. But standing there on the quiet street, she could not shake the feeling that she had not simply solved one problem tonight. She had walked directly into another one, and this one did not come with a clear price attached, or a clear way out. Behind her, through the tall windows of the building, she could still see him watching her leave, his expression calm, patient, and entirely certain that whatever she believed about tonight being finished, he already knew otherwise. The next morning, Mara woke to the sound of her father's voice on the phone, laughing in a way she had not heard in months. When she came downstairs, he was sitting at the kitchen table with a strange, disbelieving look on his face. "It is gone," he said, before she could ask. "The debt, all of it. A man called this morning and told me the account was closed, paid in full, no explanation given." Lily, still half asleep, wandered in and asked what was happening. Their father simply hugged her, unable to explain something he barely understood himself. Mara said nothing about the party, or the dance, or the arrangement she had made in a quiet hallway the night before. She told herself it did not matter how the debt disappeared, only that it had. She almost believed that for the rest of the day. 3 days later, a car appeared outside her apartment building, sleek and dark, driven by a man who introduced himself simply as Victor. He did not explain who sent him. He did not need to. "Mr. Cross is expecting you this evening," Victor said, holding the car door open with the patience of someone who had done this many times before and expected no argument. Mara had almost convinced herself the dinner would not actually happen, that perhaps a man as busy and important as Damian Cross had already forgotten a promise made in passing on the night of a party. Standing in front of the car now, she understood how foolish that hope had been. She got in. The drive was quiet, the city passing by in blurred lights outside the window. Victor did not attempt conversation, and Mara did not either, using the silence instead to prepare herself for whatever version of Damian Cross she would meet outside the golden lighting of a crowded event, in a setting far more private and far more revealing. The restaurant they arrived at was closed to the public, a small, elegant space with only one table set, positioned near a window overlooking the water. Damian was already seated when she arrived, dressed more casually than she had seen him before, though nothing about him seemed casual at all. "You came," he said, standing briefly as she approached the table. "I was beginning to wonder." "I did not think I had much choice," Mara replied, taking her seat across from him. "There is always a choice," he said. "You simply weighed the outcomes and decided this one suited you better." Mara did not argue, mostly because she suspected he was right, and she did not enjoy admitting that to herself. Dinner began with polite, careful conversation, the kind two strangers exchange when neither wants to reveal too much too quickly. Damian asked about her father's shop, about Lily's studies, about the apartment they lived in. Mara answered honestly but briefly, unwilling to hand over more of her life than necessary, to a man she still did not fully trust. "You ask a lot of questions for someone who does not usually explain himself," she said eventually. "I like understanding the people I decide to keep around," he said simply, as though the sentence was not unsettling at all. "Keep around," Mara repeated. "That is an interesting way to describe a dinner." Something shifted slightly in his expression, a flicker of consideration, as though he had said more than he intended. "Forgive me," he said. "I am not accustomed to softening my words for anyone." "Then don't," Mara said. "I would rather understand exactly what this is than be confused by kindness that might not be kindness at all." For a long moment, Damian studied her across the table, something almost respectful in his gaze. "Very well," he said. "This is not simply a dinner between two people who met once at a party. I do not offer second meetings casually. I do not extend invitations without reason. You interested me the night we met, and very little interests me anymore." "Why?" Mara asked. "What about me could possibly interest a man who owns half the city without anyone knowing it?" "Because you were terrified," he said, "and you asked anyway. Most people who fear me either avoid me entirely or flatter me obviously, hoping it will protect them. You did neither. You simply stated what you needed and accepted whatever answer came." Mara considered this for a moment, uncertain whether to feel flattered or unsettled by being studied so closely by someone who clearly missed very little. The rest of dinner passed more easily than she expected, the conversation drifting toward lighter subjects, though even those carried an undertone of careful observation on his part. She learned small pieces of him in return, fragments offered without elaboration, a brother he no longer spoke about, a business empire inherited rather than chosen, a life built entirely around control, because the alternative, at some point in his past, had cost him something he clearly still carried. When the evening ended, Victor drove her home in the same quiet car, and Mara found herself replaying the conversation long after she should have fallen asleep. The following weeks blurred together in a pattern she had not anticipated. Dinners became more frequent, though never officially scheduled, arriving instead as sudden invitations delivered through Victor with little warning. Mara told herself each time that she would refuse eventually, that this arrangement had clearly extended far beyond the original agreement. Yet each time, she found herself in the car again, curiosity outweighing caution. It was during the fourth dinner that she first noticed something had changed in how Damian's world treated her. A waiter who had been indifferent toward her on previous visits now greeted her by name. Victor no longer waited outside, but walked her fully to the door, staying close, in a way that felt less like courtesy and more like quiet supervision. When she mentioned taking a weekend trip with a coworker, Damian's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, and the trip was mysteriously canceled 2 days later due to a scheduling conflict at her workplace that Mara had not created herself. She began to suspect the conflict had not been a coincidence. "Did you have anything to do with my trip being canceled?" she asked him directly during their next meeting, unwilling to pretend she had not noticed. Damian did not deny it immediately, which told her everything before he even spoke. "I did not think it was a good time for you to be away," he said calmly. "That was not your decision to make." "Perhaps not," he agreed. "But I made it anyway." Mara felt something cold settle in her stomach, the first clear sign that the man across from her operated by rules that did not include asking permission. "You cannot simply control parts of my life because you find me interesting," she said. "I am not controlling your life," Damian replied. "I am protecting an investment." "I am not an investment. Everything I care about eventually becomes one," he said, his tone quiet but absolute. "It is the only way I know how to hold on to things without losing them." The honesty of the statement disarmed her more than any denial could have. She understood in that moment that this was not a man pretending to be something softer than he was. This was exactly who he was, without apology, without disguise. "I have a family," Mara said, "a life. I cannot simply disappear into whatever this is becoming." "I am not asking you to disappear," Damian said. "I am asking you to stay close enough that I do not have to wonder where you are. That is not how relationships work. It is how mine works, he said simply. I did not choose this world. It chose me, a long time ago, and it taught me that the only way to keep anything is to never let go of it carelessly. Mara wanted to argue further, but something in his voice, some rare crack in the calm exterior, stopped her. She thought about the brother he mentioned once, and never again. She thought about the way his jaw tightened whenever the subject of family arose. Whatever made him this way had clearly cost him deeply, and though it did not excuse his behavior, it explained it in a way she had not expected to understand so quickly. That night, walking back to her apartment after Victor dropped her off earlier than usual, Mara noticed a car parked quietly across the street, unfamiliar, engine idling. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself the same thing the following night, when the same car appeared again. By the end of the week, she could no longer pretend it was coincidence. She confronted Victor directly the next time he arrived to collect her for dinner. "Is someone watching my apartment?" she asked. Victor's expression remained perfectly neutral, the practiced blankness of someone trained never to reveal more than necessary. "Mr. Cross prefers to know that you are safe," he said simply. "That is not an answer." "It is the only one I am permitted to give," Victor replied, opening the car door for her with the same patient courtesy as always. Mara got in, her mind racing through the growing realization that whatever this arrangement had become, it was no longer something she could easily step away from. The debt had been erased weeks ago. The original agreement had technically been fulfilled many times over. Yet here she was, still arriving for dinners she had never officially agreed to continue, still noticing unfamiliar cars outside her home, still feeling the quiet, invisible boundaries of a life that was slowly being redrawn around her without her full consent. That evening she asked Damian directly what would happen if she simply decided to stop coming. He considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I would come find you," he said, "and ask why. And if I did not have a good answer, then I would keep asking," he said, "until you gave me one I could accept." Mara stared at him across the table, understanding for the first time exactly how deep she had already stepped into something far larger than a simple debt repaid in exchange for one dance. The kindness he showed her, the honesty, the quiet moments where he seemed almost human, existed alongside something else entirely, something possessive and absolute that did not recognize the concept of walking away as something she was fully allowed to choose. She was no longer certain which version of him frightened her more, the one who controlled everything around her without apology, or the one who made her feel, however briefly, like she mattered to someone for the first time in longer than she wanted to admit. Either way, she understood now that leaving would not be as simple as standing up and walking out the door. Whatever this had become, it had already grown roots, and roots, she was beginning to learn, did not release their hold easily, no matter how much the person they wrapped around wished otherwise. 6 weeks after the night of the dance, Mara had settled into a strange rhythm she never expected to accept. Dinners with Damian happened almost twice a week now, and though she still questioned every boundary he quietly redrew around her life, she no longer pretended the arrangement felt entirely unwanted. That frightened her more than anything he had ever said or done. Her father's shop had reopened fully, free of debt, thriving in ways it had not thrived in years. Lily had started university without the constant worry of tuition hanging over the family. On paper, everything Mara had wanted the night she walked into that golden room had come true. Yet she still woke some mornings with an uneasy feeling she could not name, a sense that safety, in this world, always arrived with conditions attached. The feeling proved accurate sooner than she expected. It began with a name she had never heard before, Aldrich Payne. Damian mentioned it only once, briefly, during a dinner where his usual composure seemed thinner than normal. He did not explain who Payne was, only that certain territories once quietly respected as belonging to Damian's organization had recently seen unwelcome activity that suggested someone was testing boundaries that had remained untested for years. "Is this dangerous for you?" Mara asked. "It is inconvenient," Damian replied, though something in his tone suggested inconvenient was simply the word he preferred over the more accurate one. Mara did not push further that night, though the name stayed with her, quietly lodged in the back of her mind like a splinter she could not quite locate. 2 weeks later, she understood exactly why he had been so careful never to mention it again. She was walking home from work, taking the same route she had taken hundreds of times before, when a car pulled up slowly beside her on an otherwise quiet street. She barely had time to register the strangeness of it before 2 men stepped out, moving with the kind of calm efficiency that told her immediately this was not random. "Miss Hale," one of them said, his voice pleasant in a way that made her skin crawl. "Mr. Payne." Mara turned to run, but the second man was already too close, and within moments she found herself guided firmly into the back of the car, her protests met with quiet, unbothered patience, as though her fear was simply an expected part of the process rather than something that concerned them at all. They did not harm her. That much she understood almost immediately, some clinical part of her brain still functioning despite the panic flooding everything else. They needed her intact. They needed her useful. Whatever role she was about to play in this, her safety mattered only as far as it served their purpose. She was taken to a quiet building on the edge of the city, led into a plain room with a single table and 2 chairs, and left alone for what felt like hours, though it was likely closer to 40 minutes. When the door finally opened again, a man in an expensive coat walked in, taking the seat across from her with the unhurried confidence of someone who had planned this conversation carefully in advance. "Aldrich Payne," he said, introducing himself as though they were meeting under entirely ordinary circumstances. "I apologize for the abrupt invitation. Mr. Cross does not respond well to polite requests, so I decided a more direct approach was necessary." "What do you want from me?" Mara asked, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage. "Leverage," Payne said simply. "Damian Cross has spent years building something untouchable, mostly because he never allows anyone close enough to threaten it. You are the first exception he has made in a long time, which makes you remarkably valuable to someone like me." Mara's stomach turned at the realization of exactly how deeply she had already been drawn into a world she barely understood. "He will not simply hand over anything because you are holding me," she said, though even as she spoke the words, she was not entirely certain they were true. "We shall see," Payne said, standing calmly and heading toward the door. "In my experience, men like Damian Cross discover their limits very quickly once something they actually care about is placed at risk." He left her alone again, the door locking with a quiet final click. Mara spent the next several hours pacing the small room, searching for any possible way out, though the single window was sealed shut, and the door showed no weakness she could exploit. She thought about her father, about Lily, about the quiet life she had been trying so desperately to protect only months earlier. She thought about Damian, and the strange, complicated tangle of fear and dependence she had allowed herself to feel toward him. She wondered, in the isolation of that locked room, whether he would actually come for her, or whether the cold, controlling version of him she sometimes glimpsed would calculate the risk and decide she was not worth the trouble. She did not have to wonder for long. Later that night, the building outside her room grew suddenly, unmistakably chaotic. She heard raised voices, hurried footsteps, doors slamming somewhere in the distance. The single guard who had been stationed outside her room disappeared from his post entirely, and moments later, the door swung open. Damian stood there, and Mara barely recognized him. Gone was the calm, composed man from every dinner they had shared. In his place stood someone sharper, colder, his eyes scanning the room and landing on her with an intensity that made the earlier fear of her kidnappers feel almost mild by comparison. "Are you hurt?" he asked, crossing the room in a few quick steps. "No," Mara said, her voice shaking despite her attempt to stay composed. "They did not hurt me. They wanted leverage, not damage." Something dark passed behind his eyes at the word leverage, an expression Mara had never seen on him before, one that suggested Aldrich Payne had made a miscalculation he would come to regret. "We need to leave now," Damian said, taking her hand, though his grip trembled slightly, a small crack in the otherwise controlled exterior he usually wore so effortlessly. They moved quickly through the hallway, past two men lying unconscious near the entrance, though Mara did not ask what had happened to them, some instinct telling her the details were better left unexplored for now. Victor waited outside with the car already running, his expression grim and alert as they climbed inside. The drive back into the city was silent for several long minutes, Mara staring out the window as the adrenaline slowly drained from her body, leaving behind a shaky exhaustion she had never experienced before. "How did you find me?" she finally asked. "I have known where Payne operates for months," Damian said. "I simply never expected him to be foolish enough to act on it." "He said you would not risk anything to save me," Mara said quietly. "He seemed certain of it." Damian's jaw tightened, the same reaction she had noticed weeks earlier whenever certain subjects touched too close to something buried deep beneath his composure. "He was wrong," Damian said simply, though the flatness of his voice did nothing to hide the intensity behind the words. They arrived at his home rather than her apartment, a decision Mara did not question given the circumstances. Inside, away from Victor and the tension of the car ride, Damian finally allowed something to slip through the careful control he maintained so consistently around everyone else. "I should have protected you better," he said, his voice quieter now, almost unfamiliar in its rawness. "I knew Payne was testing boundaries. I underestimated how far he would go." "This is not your fault," Mara said, though she was not entirely certain she believed that herself. "It is exactly my fault," Damian said. "You are only in danger because you are close to me. That is the truth, whether either of us wants to hear it." Mara studied him carefully, noticing for the first time how deeply frightened he seemed beneath the anger, a fear that had nothing to do with his own safety and everything to do with hers. "Tell me about your brother," she said quietly, remembering the one detail he had shared weeks earlier and never mentioned again. Damian's expression shifted, something old and painful surfacing briefly before he pushed it back down with visible effort. "Nathaniel," he said, "my younger brother. He died because of exactly this kind of situation, years ago, before I fully understood the weight of the world I inherited. I was careless once. I promised myself I would never be careless again. And now? Now I am terrified," Damian admitted, the honesty of the word landing heavily in the quiet room. "That history is repeating itself, and this time I might not be fast enough to stop it." Mara reached for his hand, an instinct she did not fully examine before acting on it. "You were fast enough tonight," she said. "Tonight," Damian repeated, "was luck as much as skill. I do not intend to rely on luck again." The following days passed in a tense, watchful quiet. Security around Mara's apartment increased significantly, though this time she did not resent the presence of unfamiliar cars parked outside, understanding now exactly what kind of danger they were meant to prevent. Her father and Lily were quietly relocated to a safer property for a short period, an arrangement Damian insisted on despite Mara's initial hesitation. "I do not want them involved in this," she said. "They already are," Damian replied. "The moment Payne learned about you, your entire family became part of this conflict, whether either of us wanted that or not." Mara understood the truth of that statement, even as she resented it deeply. The life she had been trying so hard to protect had grown tangled with a world of power and consequence she had never asked to be part of, yet here she was, fully immersed in it, unable to separate herself from either the danger or the man at its center. Payne did not disappear quietly after the failed kidnapping. Word soon reached Damian that the rival organization had grown bolder, emboldened rather than deterred by their earlier failure, testing new pressure points across the city in an attempt to weaken Damian's influence piece by piece. Mara watched him change during this period, the calm confidence she had first encountered replaced by something more focused, more dangerous, a man clearly willing to protect what belonged to him by any means the situation required. It should have frightened her more than it did. Instead, she found herself oddly steadied by his presence, trusting, despite every warning sign, that he would not let anything happen to the people she loved. One evening, sitting together in the quiet study of his home, Mara finally asked the question that had been building inside her since the night of her rescue. "Why does this matter so much to you?" she asked. "I was simply someone who walked in asking for a favor. Why does protecting me matter enough to risk everything you have built?" Damian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fireplace rather than at her. "Because for the first time since Nathaniel died," he said finally, "I found someone I actually wanted to protect, rather than someone I felt obligated to control. That distinction terrifies me more than pain ever could." Mara did not respond immediately, letting the weight of his confession settle fully between them. Whatever this had become, it was no longer simply an arrangement born from debt and convenience. Somewhere along the way, without either of them fully choosing it, it had grown into something far more complicated, far more real, and far more dangerous than either of them had originally intended. And with Aldrich Payne still circling somewhere in the shadows of the city, refusing to accept his earlier failure as final, Mara understood that whatever peace they had found tonight would not last nearly long enough. 3 weeks passed with no direct move from Payne, though the quiet did nothing to ease the tension settling permanently into Damian's household. Mara noticed the change in him gradually, the way his attention split constantly between conversations with her and quiet phone calls he stepped away to take, his expression darkening slightly each time he returned. "You are not telling me everything," she said one evening, watching him set his phone down with more force than necessary. "There are things you do not need to carry," Damian replied. "I already carry the fact that a man once locked me in a room because I matter to you," Mara said. "I think I can handle a little more honesty." Damian studied her for a long moment before finally sitting down across from her, the careful distance he usually maintained during difficult conversations noticeably absent. "Payne is not simply testing boundaries anymore," he admitted. "He is preparing to make a larger move, something meant to weaken my position permanently rather than temporarily. My people believe he intends to act within the next 2 weeks. And what does that mean for us?" "It means the next 2 weeks will determine a great deal," Damian said. "Possibly everything." Mara absorbed this quietly, aware that the danger surrounding them was no longer background noise to their relationship, but something actively shaping every decision either of them made. "I want to help," she said. "No," Damian said immediately, the words sharp and final. "You do not get to decide that for me," Mara replied, her own voice hardening in response to his. "This is not a negotiation," Damian said. "Payne already used you once as leverage. I will not create another opportunity for that to happen again. By keeping me locked away here like something fragile?" Mara asked. "That is not protection. That is another version of the same cage he tried to put me in." The comparison landed harder than Mara expected, something flickering across Damian's face that suggested the accusation struck closer to a truth he had not fully examined about himself. "I am trying to keep you alive," he said quietly. "I know," Mara said, her tone softening slightly, "but you cannot protect me by making every decision about my life without asking me first. That is not partnership. That is just a gentler version of control." Damian did not respond immediately, the silence between them heavy with everything neither of them had said clearly enough before now. "You are right," he finally admitted, the words clearly difficult for him to say. "I do not know how to want something without trying to own it completely. It is the only way I have ever known how to hold on to anything without losing it." "Then learn a different way," Mara said, "because I am not something you can simply arrange around like furniture in one of your buildings. If you want me in your life, you have to actually let me be part of it, decisions included." The vulnerability in his expression in that moment was unlike anything Mara had witnessed from him before, a brief window into the wounded, careful man existing beneath the composed exterior he presented to the rest of the world. "I do not know how to do that," he admitted. "I have spent so many years controlling everything around me that I am not certain I remember how to simply trust someone with their own choices." "Then we learn together," Mara said, "starting now." It was not a full resolution, but it marked a shift between them, a quiet acknowledgement that whatever future they were building together could not survive on control alone, no matter how deeply rooted that instinct remained in him. The following days brought increased activity from Payne's organization, small incidents scattered across the city that seemed designed to provoke a reaction rather than cause significant damage. A warehouse briefly occupied without explanation, a supplier suddenly refusing to honor a long-standing contract, small, deliberate irritations meant to unsettle rather than destroy, testing patience rather than territory directly. Damian remained composed throughout, though Mara could see the toll it was taking on him, sleep becoming scarce, conversations growing shorter, decisions made with increasing urgency. She began attending certain meetings alongside him, not as a passive observer, but as someone whose insight he had slowly, reluctantly, begun to value. During one such meeting, discussing a warehouse dispute with several of Damian's associates, Mara noticed a detail no one else seemed to catch immediately, a small inconsistency in the timeline Payne's people had used to justify their occupation of the property. She raised it carefully, watching the room shift slightly, as her observation revealed a lie in Payne's justification that could be used against him. "That is a significant find," one of the older associates admitted, clearly surprised. Damian said nothing immediately, though the look he gave Mara afterward carried something close to genuine respect, an acknowledgement that her presence in these discussions was not simply tolerated, but valuable. "You see things I miss," he told her later that evening, once they were alone, "because you are not trapped inside the same assumptions the rest of us have carried for years." "Then let me keep seeing them," Mara said, "instead of trying to protect me from ever being close enough to see anything at all." Damian nodded slowly, something settling in his expression that suggested he was, however imperfectly, beginning to understand the difference between protecting someone and controlling them. The final confrontation, when it came, arrived faster than either of them expected. Payne, growing impatient with the slow erosion strategy that had so far failed to produce the outcome he wanted, decided to escalate directly, arranging a meeting under the pretense of negotiating a truce between the two organizations. Damian agreed to attend, against the advice of several people around him, believing it was the only way to end the conflict before it consumed more resources, more danger, more risk to the people he cared about. Mara insisted on accompanying him, and after the argument they had already had about decisions being made without her input, Damian did not refuse this time, though his reluctance was obvious in every tense line of his posture as they arrived at the agreed location, a quiet, neutral property on the edge of the city. Payne was waiting when they arrived, flanked by several of his own people, his expression carrying the same calm confidence Mara remembered from the room where he had once held her. "I did not expect you to bring her," Payne said, glancing toward Mara with open curiosity. "She stays," Damian said simply, leaving no room for negotiation on that particular point. The meeting began civilly enough, both sides discussing terms that might end the escalating conflict without further incidents on either side. But as the conversation progressed, Mara noticed something shift in Payne's demeanor, a subtle confidence that suggested this meeting was never intended to end peacefully at all. "You know," Payne said eventually, his tone almost conversational, "I have spent months trying to understand what makes you different from every other man who has held power in this city before you. I think I finally understand it." "And what is that?" Damian asked, his posture tensing slightly. "You have a weakness now," Payne said, his eyes flicking briefly toward Mara, "something you actually care about losing. Every other rival I have faced eventually falls because they either care about nothing and therefore have nothing to protect, or they care about too much and therefore hesitate when hesitation costs them everything. I believe," Payne said, standing slowly, "that we are about to find out." What followed happened quickly. a coordinated attempt by Payne's people to seize control of the meeting entirely, though Damian's own people, anticipating exactly this kind of betrayal, were prepared far more thoroughly than Payne expected. The confrontation resolved swiftly, decisively, and with considerably less violence than Payne's overconfidence had assumed necessary, his own miscalculation about Damian's preparedness becoming the very weakness that ended his ambitions that evening. By the time it was finished, Payne's influence in the city had effectively collapsed, his own people quickly distancing themselves from an operation that had clearly failed at every level of planning. Damian turned to Mara immediately once the situation was fully resolved, checking for any sign of harm with the same intensity he had shown the night he rescued her from Payne's first attempt weeks earlier. "I am fine," Mara assured him, though her hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of everything that had just occurred. "You should not have been here," Damian said, though this time the words carried less command and more genuine worry. "I chose to be here," Mara reminded him gently. "That was the point, remember?" Damian exhaled slowly, something releasing in his posture that had been tightly wound for weeks. "It is over," he said, as though confirming the fact for himself as much as for her. "For now," Mara said carefully. "For now," Damian agreed, "is enough." They returned to his home that night in a silence far different from the tense quiet of previous weeks. Something resolved between them even as new questions began quietly forming about what came next, now that the immediate danger had finally passed, and the two of them were left to figure out exactly what kind of future they actually wanted to build together. In the weeks following Payne's collapse, the city settled into an unfamiliar calm, one Mara had not experienced since long before the night she first walked through those golden doors asking for help. Her father's shop continued thriving. Lily finished her semester with results better than she had ever managed before, free at last of the quiet financial dread that had shadowed their family for years. On the surface, life had returned to something resembling normal. Beneath that surface, however, Mara found herself facing a question she had been avoiding since the moment the immediate danger passed. What exactly did she want her life to look like now, and did that life include a man who had built his entire identity around control, even as he slowly, imperfectly, tried to unlearn that instinct for her sake? The answer did not arrive easily. She began spending less time at Damian's home, not out of anger, but out of a genuine need to remember who she was, outside the constant orbit of his world. She returned to her old routines, her old friendships, small pieces of a life she had nearly lost sight of during the months consumed by debt, danger, and a man whose presence had a way of eclipsing everything around him. Damian noticed the distance immediately, though to his credit, he did not attempt to close it the way he once might have, through control or quiet manipulation of circumstances around her. Instead, he simply waited, visible in small gestures rather than grand ones, a message here, a brief visit there, never demanding, always present enough to remind her he had not disappeared, without ever pushing hard enough to feel like pressure. One evening, nearly a month after Payne's collapse, Damian arrived at her apartment unannounced, something he had not done since the early days of their arrangement. "I am not here to ask you for anything," he said, standing at her door with an unfamiliar hesitance in his posture. "I simply wanted you to know that whatever you decide about this, about us, I will accept it, even if I decide to walk away completely," Mara asked. "Even then," Damian said, though the words clearly cost him something significant to say aloud, "I spent a long time believing that holding on to things tightly was the only way to keep them. You taught me that tightness is often exactly what drives people away. I would rather lose you having learned that lesson than keep you the way I once might have, through fear disguised as protection." Mara studied him carefully, searching for any trace of the calculated control that had once defined nearly everything about him. She found instead something rawer, more uncertain, a man genuinely unsure of his place in her life for what seemed like the first time since they had met. "Come inside," she said finally. "We should talk properly, without an audience of guards waiting outside. They sat together in her small living room, a space entirely unlike the elegant restaurants and quiet studies where most of their previous conversations had taken place. Here, surrounded by the modest furniture and familiar clutter of her actual life, the conversation felt different, more honest, stripped of the power and wealth that had shaped so much of their history together. "I need you to understand something," Mara said. "I do not regret walking through those doors that first night. Whatever this became, it saved my family, and somewhere along the way, it also gave me something I did not expect to find." "But," Damian said quietly, sensing what was coming, "but I spent months feeling like my life was being rearranged around your comfort rather than my own choices," Mara continued. "I need to know that if I choose to stay, it will actually be a choice, not simply another arrangement I fell into, because leaving felt impossible." "I can offer you that," Damian said. "I cannot promise I will always get it right. Years of control do not disappear because I want them to. But I can promise you will never again wonder whether staying was truly your decision." "How can I trust that?" Damian reached into his coat and withdrew a folded document, placing it carefully on the table between them. "What is this?" Mara asked. "An account, established in your name alone," he said. "Enough to give you complete independence, should you ever want it. A home, entirely separate from mine, already purchased and waiting, requiring nothing from me should you choose to walk away today and never look back. I am not offering this to convince you to stay. I am offering it so that whatever you decide it as someone with genuine freedom, not someone who feels trapped by circumstance." Mara stared at the document, understanding the weight of what he was offering. This was not the same man who had once canceled her weekend trip without asking, who had once treated her safety as something only he was qualified to manage. This was someone who had actually listened, actually changed, even if imperfectly, even if the change had come slowly and with visible difficulty. "Why now?" she asked. "Why offer this after everything that happened, after pain, after all the danger we survived together?" "Because surviving danger together taught me what actually matters," Damian said. "I do not want a version of you that stays because leaving feels impossible. I want the version of you that chooses to stay because staying is genuinely what you want, even with a full and real alternative sitting right in front of you." Mara took several days to consider her answer, spending time with her father and Lily, walking through the parts of her old life she had nearly lost during the months consumed by debt and danger. She visited the account Damian had established, confirming it was exactly as real and unconditional as he claimed, a genuine door left open rather than a carefully disguised trap. She thought about the man who had once refused to let her leave a dance floor without renegotiating the terms of an agreement she had never fully consented to. She thought about the man who had shown up at her door weeks later, offering complete freedom instead, having clearly wrestled with every instinct that told him to hold on tighter instead. Both men existed within Damian Cross, she realized. The question was not which version was real, but which version she wanted to build a future with, understanding fully that growth was rarely instant or complete, that someone capable of genuine change did not become perfect overnight, only capable of choosing differently when it mattered most. She made her decision on a quiet afternoon nearly 2 weeks after his visit, walking once again through the same golden doors where this entire story had begun months earlier. The restaurant was empty this time. No masquerade, no crowd of curious onlookers. Simply Damian, standing near the same spot where they had first danced, waiting for an answer he had genuinely prepared himself to accept either way. "I read through the account details," Mara said, approaching him slowly. "Everything you offered was real. Complete freedom, no conditions attached." "And what did you decide?" Damian asked, his composure visibly strained beneath the calm surface he still tried to maintain. "I decided that freedom was never really the question," Mara said. "I already know I could walk away and build a full life on my own. You made certain of that. The real question was whether staying with you could ever feel like an actual choice, rather than something I fell into because the alternative once felt too frightening to consider. And your answer?" "I am staying," Mara said, Not because I need you, and not because leaving feels impossible. I am staying because somewhere in the middle of debt and danger and everything that followed, I found someone worth choosing, flaws included, as long as those flaws keep genuinely trying to become something better. Something shifted visibly in Damian's expression, relief mixed with something quieter, more vulnerable than she had ever seen from him before. I do not deserve that answer, he said. Not fully, not yet. Maybe not yet, Mara agreed. But you are working toward deserving it, and that matters more than arriving there perfectly on the first attempt. He reached for her hand, the same way he had on the night of the dance months earlier, though this time the gesture carried none of the possessive certainty from before, only a quiet, genuine question, asking rather than assuming. Mara took his hand freely, without hesitation, without the fear that had once colored nearly every interaction between them. "One more dance?" Damian asked, a faint smile appearing, the first fully unguarded smile Mara had seen from him since the night they met. "Only if you promise this one actually ends when the song does," Mara said, though her tone carried warmth rather than warning. "I promise," Damian said, pulling her gently into position as quiet music began playing somewhere in the empty restaurant, arranged, Mara suspected, well in advance of her arrival. They danced slowly, without an audience, without the golden crowd of strangers who had witnessed their first encounter months earlier. This time, there was no debt hanging over the moment, no fear disguised as negotiation, no uncertain terms waiting to be renegotiated once the music ended. Just two people who had survived danger, misunderstanding, and difficult growth together, choosing, freely and fully, to build something real from everything that remained. As the song came to its natural end, Damian did not release her hand immediately, though this time Mara did not tense with uncertainty about what might come next. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now," Damian said, "we simply continue, one honest choice at a time, for as long as you decide, this is where you want to be." Mara smiled, resting her head briefly against his shoulder, finally certain that whatever came next, it would be built on something far steadier than fear or obligation. It would be built on choice, freely given and freely returned, exactly as it always should have been from the very beginning.